The sections that we're reading today are the first three sections of the chapter on the public and the private realm. We're going to give about 10 minutes to each section and have, I hope, plenty of time in between after each one for Q&A, for questions. Why does she begin the book after a preface and an introduction with the discussion of the public and private? It's an important question. These are very important chapters in her book. And it's worth looking at this first sentence of section 4. The vita activa, which we talked about last meeting, or human life insofar it is actively engaged in doing something, is always rooted in a world of men and of man-made things, which it never leaves and never altogether transcends. Her point here is that the vita activa, this life of the active life of action, which she has argued is the essence of human life, happens in public. It happens with other people. It happens with other men, other women, and other man-made things. And so the first chapter 4, the first section, is about this realm of the public and how important it is to what she considers to be a human life, the vita activa. She makes a distinction here between the social and the political, and this is an important distinction in Arendt's work. It's a very difficult one, and we'll be talking a little bit about it in section 6 later. But let's just imagine it as very simple. The social is the realm of the home and the family, or of conformity or of oneness. It's the social is a group of people who are all together as one. And the political is the realm of the polis, or the politics. That is a realm of plurality and distinction. Plurality, the public realm, the political realm, is what she's really interested in here. She says has two main activities involved in it: speech and action. And the great example of the speaker and the actor is Achilles, the doer of great deeds and the speaker of great words, as she quotes from Homer. And this is in many ways the model that she has of the public realm, a realm in which we engage with others who are different from us, different from ourselves, not through violence, but through what she calls action and speech. Action is the doing of things that are surprising and new, that make people say, oh, that's something I need to think about. That's something I need to address. And in doing so, to act and to engage in action makes people look at you. And making people look at you, they start talking about you, and they create a public world. Speaking, persuading, also makes people sit up and listen to you. But it's without violence. And in all true politics, the emphasis, she says, slowly switches from action to speech and to persuasion, but it leaves behind violence, which is why she says the old word for politician is a rhetor, someone who speaks well. And that the zoon politikon, the political animal, is the animal, the man who has logos, speech. It's speech which makes man a political being, and in many ways it's speech that makes man fully human in Arendt's telling. So this first chapter, I'm gonna somewhat leave it here and ask if there's any questions about chapter 4. It's really simply laying out this idea of man as a political animal, that is a speaking animal, and the public or political realm as the realm in which men and now women, it was men when in the Greeks, and she's writing about the Greeks here often, but where speech is a way of life and people attend to it. And this public realm is for her absolutely essential to a well-functioning humanity. And as we'll see in chapters, as we get further into this chapter in later sections, she worries that this public realm is disappearing. So, are there particular questions? I'm going to spend less time on this chapter unless there's really a lot of questions, because the other chapters are meatier. But if there are questions about chapter 4, I'm happy to take them now. You can either type them in or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Do we move on to chapter 5? Does anyone have a question on chapter 4? Okay. So let me move on to chapter 5, where I think things get a little bit more interesting and difficult. This chapter is called The Polis and the Household. And we need to think of the polis and the household now as two sides, right? On the one side is the polis, the public realm, the realm of politics. On the other hand is the household. We can think of the household as the private and the polis as the public. We can think of the polis and the public as the common world, that which we hold in common. And we can think of the household as the private world. And what is the household and the private world focused on? It's on the maintenance of life. And this should come. You should recall back when we read the preface, if you were then there with us then, this distinction between the given of life, which is one aspect of man, and the artificial nature of life, which is another aspect of man. And the private is this given maintenance of life, and the public is the space of artifice, where we create things together. So as we begin section 5 on the polis and the household.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Karen.
Hi. Hi.
You can mute your mic for a little bit. We're going into section 5. The polis and the private, the polis and the household. The first thing she says, this is a very old distinction, the polis and the private. But there's something new that's emerged, largely in the 19th and 20th centuries, and that's what she calls the social. And the social and the rise of the social is going to diminish both the public and the private. And let's be very clear, she's more interested in the public than the private, and yet she's also quite interested in the private. And one of the issues of Arendt's scholarship is that it's mostly focused on the public for good reasons, but ignored privacy. And for those of you who have been paying attention, we've been writing a little bit more about privacy on the Arendt Center blog and websites, and our 2015 conference is going to be on privacy. So this is something I'm actually quite interested in. If we have this distinction between the polis and the household, on the one hand is the household, right? And she begins with that. And she talks about the household as the place of the sanctity of the hearth, right? The hearth. That where we set up boundaries between ourselves and the world. It's not the same as private property, she says, but the key quote and the one that really I think captures what she's after with this idea of the household is at the bottom of page 29 into page 30, where she says, what prevented the polis from violating the private lives of its citizens and made it hold sacred the boundaries surrounding each property was not respect for property, for private property as we understand it, but the fact, right? The fact that without owning a house, a man could not participate in the affairs of the world because he had no location in it which was properly his own. This is really central to her argument about the importance of the household and of privacy, which we'll read more about in later sections next month when we come back to this. Excuse me. But the premise of it here is that in order to enter the public world, in order to exist as a human being, you need some space, some space where you can, in a sense, develop as an individual. And the household, the sanctity of the hearth, the boundaries are what established that space. And one of the things you'll see as you read further into this chapter that she very much worries about is the loss of this private space, and the loss of private property, the loss of the hearth, and the loss of boundaries. She then moves on to talk about the opposite of the household, this thing called the polis. If the household is the place where we maintain life, and it's really the realm of necessity, it's the realm of what's most necessary for us, the polis is what she calls the realm of freedom and equality. Remember, for her, the polis is an artificial realm, and this is actually something that's very important in a lot of Arendt's books, and I think is often misunderstood in general, which is that for her, equality is not natural, right? She opposes all the people like Hobbes and Locke, and the liberal philosophers, or Rousseau, who think that we are by nature equal. Her argument is, by nature, we're all unequal. The great achievement, the artificial achievement of politics, is to make ourselves equal. And that is opposed to the necessity and the inequality which exists in private life and in the household. Such an equality, she says, is to live among our peers, and thus it's not the same as, it's not equality in the sense of social justice. It's not equality in the sense that we're all equal in some sort of economic sense. Equality is the same as freedom. It's to be free from inequality and to be free from rulership. And this is what she says happens in the public sphere. It's to enter a world in which we enter as citizens, and we can all talk to each other, we can vote, we can discuss, we can debate, and you have no more power than I do. We're equal citizens, and the only thing that distinguishes who has more power is our virtue, is our skill, either at acting or speaking in ways that get people to agree with us, to persuade people. And so she's now talked about these two realms, the public and the private, the household and the polis. And she says that there was throughout history a gulf between these two realms. And it was part of being human that you at some point were in the private, and then at times you crossed over and became a citizen in the public. And she says that changed a bit in the Middle Ages, but there was something similar. You had your private life, and then you had your sacred life in the splendor of God in the church. Now, the church wasn't political, but it was a realm in which you left the realm of necessity and the private behind to enter a different realm. And she says, whether you're moving from the private to the polis or from the private to the sacred, these moves take courage. And thus, she says in this famous line, at the end of this section, she says that the political virtue par excellence is courage. Why courage? Because it is courage which motivates us to leave our private world of necessity and enter the world of politics. Why is that courage? Because when we enter the world of politics, we, of course, expose ourselves not only to ridicule and to being not successful and not persuasive, but as Socrates learned, and many have learned since him, and in fact, as some people learned in France 2 days ago, to death. To enter the world of politics is always courageous. And from her point of view, we need to understand that there is this historically been this sharp distinction between the world of the household, the necessity of private sphere, the maintenance of life on the one hand, and the world of the polis and the public sphere on the other. And to cross that gulf requires courage. So this is about the rise of the social. And the social is, as I said, a new phenomenon for her, whereas the public and the private are old. The public polis and the household are old. The social emerges. and it changes the value of both the private and the public. So one thing we have to understand is that for the ancients, privacy was privative, right? The private was that which was privative, which means it was deprived, and to live only in private was like a slave. And she begins this chapter by talking about the fact that the 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and now 20th and 21st centuries, have seen an enormous enrichment of the private sphere through what she calls modern individualism. So that modern privacy, she says, is actually fundamentally different from ancient privacy. Whereas ancient privacy was this sort of household in the realm of necessity and need, and thus a privation and almost being separate and deprived and enslaved, modern privacy is a shelter for the intimate, and thus is opposed not to the polis, to the public, but to the social, or what she calls conformity. So the great thinker of modern privacy is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and she talks a bit about him. But the point is that in people like Rousseau, and in the rise of poetry, and in the rise of music, what we see are people developing their private individualism as a way to resist the sense of conformism about belonging to society. Insofar as society is starting to impose norms and rules on people, dress codes, codes of civility, codes of behavior, privacy emerges as a shelter where we can, in a sense, separate ourselves from that and claim, well, maybe everybody is a worker and everybody is pretty much middle class, but I write poetry, or I sing jazz, or I write the blues. And we then create a sense of private distinction for ourselves. That is for her really quite important. But at the same time as that's happening, it's happening in reaction to what she calls this unbelievable rise of the social, and the decline of the family. So whereas it used to be that privacy was the family against the polis, now privacy is the individual against the social. And the social is one of these terms in her work that's very hard, but I'm going to try and do a little bit to describe it here. One way she describes it is that the social is the destruction of the individual family and the emergence of what she calls one family. What does that mean, one family? It means that we talk about the family of America or the family of the nations, that we have some common characteristics that we share as French or German or as American or as human. And we begin to articulate the norms of what it means to be human or French or German or Brazilian. And that in doing so, we no longer have a kind of one-man rule or monarchical rule like the kings or queens or princes from before, but we end up with what she calls no-man rule, a rule of the mass, a rule of this one family, a rule of bureaucracy, which she calls the most social form of government, a rule of technocrats, and I want to focus on the word technocrats. It's a rule which says to people, if you want to be a good citizen, if you want to be a good father, a good mother, a good son, a good daughter, here's the rational, right way to act. We don't impose it as a king would impose it. We impose it as a norm, as this is the right way, this is the good way. And people who don't do this are abnormal or bad. And she says that this this emergence of this idea of a social norm of what's right is a modern occurrence. It's associated with the rise of the novel, the rise of individuals, the protagonist of a novel trying to distance themselves and create an individual world in a world in which people are socialized. And that this one interest of society has largely conquered politics, so that politics is less and less about meaningful disagreements about what is right and wrong, and is more about political economy, the attempt to assert what is rational, what a rationally self-interested individual should want and should do. And so she talks about this idea that the social is the one interest of society. One thing that I think is helpful to understand is how she actually says that this emerges with people like Adam Smith and the physiocrats and the economic thinkers. Because what is economics? Economics is the study of man, which says that man acts according to rational inputs. He's a rational actor. And the very idea of the invisible hand of Adam Smith, which is to say that the market, without government intervention, without people getting together and deciding what's right and wrong, the market will lead to the emergence of a common rational desire and a common rational interest, which will be the interest of society. And so what Arendt is saying is that it's with the rise of economics and the rise of society and the rise of liberalism, all of which we typically think of as leading to individualism. She says individualism emerges as a reaction against the conformism of liberal capitalist social society. And that the next step is that the number one way in which this emergence of society and the social interest is both announced and imposed is through statistics and the rise of statistics. So if you turn to page 42 to 43 are some of the most important pages of this whole book, and very interesting and worth spending a little time on it. So I just want to read these two, and then we'll take some questions. So if we start in the middle of 42, she says, the laws of statistics are valid only where large numbers or long periods are involved, and acts or events can statistically appear only as deviations or fluctuations. That's a much more complicated sentence than it originally seems. But you can't do statistical analysis with small data sets, right? If you take in statistics, you know that. But once you move towards large numbers and large data sets, what happens is that acts and events, things that are not normal, things that are surprising, things that are rare, can only appear statistically as deviations or fluctuations. So that the very statistical approach, which we're just so used to today in our social world, immediately says that anything that's abnormal is not important as deviations or fluctuations. I continue. The justification of statistics is that deeds and events are rare occurrences in everyday life and history. The reason statistics works is because we don't think that deeds and occurrences matter because they're rare. Yet the meaningfulness of everyday relationships is disclosed not in everyday life, but in rare deeds. So here's what she's saying is statistics is incredibly powerful. It works. It describes everyday life. It describes normalcy. But the meaningfulness of life, what makes life interesting, what makes life meaningful, is never in the everyday, but in the rare deeds. Just as the significance of a historical period shows itself only in the few events that illuminate it, right? If we just look at the everyday and the general history, we miss the great events, the Napoleon, the massacres, the killings, the things that actually are important, that stand out from the statistics, so that the application of the law of large numbers and long periods to politics or history, and this is really amazing to say this, signifies nothing less than the willful obliteration of their very subject matter. To statistically study politics and history obliterates politics and history. That's her claim, because it submerges politics and history to the everyday, to these long periods, to the average, when what is actually meaningful about politics and history is the rare and the new. And I'm just going to read one more section on the next page, page 43, which is some of the most powerful lines in the book, and I just want to get it out there, and then we'll start talking about questions. She says in the middle, near the bottom, about 2/3 of the way down, the unfortunate truth, right? The unfortunate truth about behaviorism and the validity of its laws, the laws of behaviorism. And behaviorism here means the study of human beings according to regular statistical laws. And the unfortunate truth about behaviorism and the validity of its laws, namely that if you do study people in large groups, you can actually come up with laws that they follow, is that the more people there are, the more likely they are to behave, and the less likely to tolerate non-behavior. It is true that statistics and behavioralism works. Most of us behave the same. Statistically, this will be shown in the leveling out of a fluctuation. So you can look at a bell curve, right? You can plot how people behave. In reality, deeds will have less and less chance to stem the tide of behavior, and events will more and more lose their significance. That is, their capacity to illuminate historical time. The more we plot graphs and offer statistics and tell people what it is that is normal and right and how people behave, the more we, whenever there's an exception to that, ignore it, treat it as an aberration. With the result being that statistical uniformity, she says, is by no means a harmless scientific ideal. It is the no longer secret political ideal of a society which, entirely submerged in the routine of everyday living, is at peace with the scientific outlook inherent in its very existence. In other words, statistical uniformity, the idea that we want, in a sense, to know what most people do, is an ideal because we want to be told what to do. We want to know what is normal because we're at peace with the scientific outlook. We're at peace with the idea that the way we should live is average every day. And we want to actually avoid the exceptions, the rare exceptions. Why? Because they're dangerous and they create disorder and they lead to us being taken away from our concerns, which are how much money we're making or our family or our friends, and actually having to engage with the public world. And so we become actually interested in statistical uniformity because what that guarantees is peace. There's much more in this chapter to be said, but I thought I'd stop here and allow for some questions because it seems like there might be a lot. So let me stop there for a second, and we have about 10 minutes. We can go a little over for questions if people would like them. The claim here is that we actually want to live in a world of statistics. We actually want to know what the experts say is right and good so that we don't have to make these decisions ourselves. One could say well, isn't that not what's happening today? Don't we have a lot of disagreement about what's right? I mean, if you look in the United States, we have an enormous apparent division in our political system. And I think that's right. And I think it comes from an interesting fact, which is that throughout the 19th and most of the 20th century, we had an enormous faith in the ability of economics and then social science and social scientists and technocrats to solve our problems. And we actually gave our political system over to technocrats to solve our problems. And what we're seeing now is the loss of faith in science and the loss of faith in technocrats. We're seeing a group of people who no longer trust the experts, which is why there's one of the great divides in America today is, well, do you trust the experts? Do you trust the people who went to the Ivy League and are now in government and are running the law schools and running the courts and are telling you this is the way to do things? And there's a populist revolt brewing against the technocrats, because for many people, the life that the technocrats have secured for us is not a life they find very meaningful. And you're seeing somewhat of a rebellion against this social interest, the one interest, which is why you're seeing a rise of homeschooling, a rise of people dropping out, both on the right and the left, on liberal, the Occupy Wall Street movement on one side and the Tea Party movement on the other. You're seeing a number of people starting to really question society. And yet that number of people is still so statistically insignificant that it doesn't in any way threaten society. And as long as it's statistically insignificant, it can be and will be ignored on both sides, if I understand Arendt's reading correctly.